David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and in recognition of the member who's just resumed his seat, the Minister for Revenue that was and is and may not be for much longer, but we leave the good voters to decide what happens in Aharu. Mr Speaker, we have a number of points of disagreement with matters covered in this bill, but Labor will be supporting the bill to a select committee. This is part of the normal process of remedial legislation, which ensures that our tax system keeps up with necessary changes, partly as private entities try to stay one jump ahead of the law, partly as issues are uncovered which require a non-policy fix. Mr Speaker, the first key provisions of this bill refer to tax rates for the 2012-13 year, and it would be utterly remiss of me not to acknowledge the context within which that occurs. National has lowered the top tax rate from 39% to 33%. That has, Mr Speaker, been probably the single most important, certainly the single most expensive economic decision that this government has made in this term of Parliament. And it has become a signal transfer of wealth to the wealthiest New Zealanders, one might say, at the expense of the many. The few have benefited. Mr Speaker, Labor absolutely objects to that realignment of the tax system. Income maldistribution is increasing, the gap between rich and poor is widening, and it benefits no one if National supporters park their Mercedes behind barbed wire fences and security cameras while the rest of the country goes around smashing windows, as has occurred in London during the riots. And that is why, Mr Bennett, Labor will be raising the top tax rate immediately upon taking office in its first budget, back up to 39%, above an indexed threshold of $150,000. Through that, Mr Speaker, and through Labor's insanely popular capital gains tax package, which has been well received the length and breadth of this country, we are able to give every New Zealander the first $5,000 of income that they earn tax-free, and that includes beneficiaries, it includes superannuitants, and it includes people on all income levels. It could not be fairer, Mr Speaker. It applies equally to everybody. And so, sir, about 95% of taxpayers will be better off because of that tax switch, the capital gains tax, in exchange for the lowering of the 5,000 threshold to zero. And of course families are under enormous cost of living pressures, and this bill also deals with GST and changes some of the GST provisions applying to late payments. It's a controversial issue and one that we look forward to hearing submissions on at Select Committee. The Minister claims that he's simply trying to clarify the law around GST on late payments, but tax experts say that late payment fees were neither a good nor a service and therefore were not supported by a first principles approach to GST. The government has, if you like, form on GST. They have raised the rate during this term of Parliament from 12.5% to 15% on all goods and services, despite a clear promise from the current Prime Minister that they would do no such thing if elected, that there would be no change to GST. Well, here's further change, Mr Speaker, and let me again make it clear. Labor will reduce the rate of GST to zero on fresh fruit and vegetables, and on the advice of the University of Otago Medical School, that will clearly increase the consumption of healthy food to the benefit of children and families. Well, Mr Speaker, members opposite are baying like hounds because they don't like to see hungry families feeding their children healthy food. Well, in Labor we do, Mr Speaker, and we've visited so many families where it is getting harder and harder in the face of inflation, in the face of a tax switch that wasn't, and in the face of a rampant increase to the cost of living. In the last year, around 7% on food prices, 1.9% on wages. If people feel worse off under National, that's because statistically they are. They've gone backwards, Mr Speaker. So National's tax switch was really a tax swindle. Hard-working Kiwi families ended up paying more every time they go to the shops, or saw little in the way of tax cuts, and under Labor they will get a reprieve. They'll get the GST off the fresh fruit and vegetables. They'll see the minimum wage rise immediately from $13 to $15 an hour, and they will see the first $5,000 of everybody's income reduced to zero. Mr. Speaker, the bill raises the employee contribution rate for KiwiSaver from 2% to 3%. This is, sir, somewhat ironic, as it was only a year before that the government reduced it from 4% to 2%. So one of the signal achievements of the current budget was to undo half of what they did the previous year. The problem, sir, is that the chopping and changing around KiwiSaver has really said to New Zealanders that they can't trust this government in terms of policies around their long-term savings. And New Zealanders are looking for certainty, Mr. Speaker, and very soon when Labour unveils its, I think, groundbreaking savings policy, they will get certainty, because we will be planning for the long term. New Zealanders will be better off with Labour's savings policy, and I know there's a lot of eagerness out there, both in the media and in the electorate, to see the details of that, and we look forward to bringing that to the country in the very, very near future. Mr. Speaker, let me briefly refer to several of the more technical aspects of the bill. The Working for Families tax credits. Again, Working for Families springs to mind, sir, as a thing that the Prime Minister said National wouldn't change. Of course, in this year's budget they did, but same old, the Minister for broken promises. Mr. Speaker, look through companies. Now, there's a euphemism if I ever heard one. Everybody knows that qualifying companies attribute losses to the taxpayer, but benefits to the directors and the shareholders. And look-through companies are a kind of way of preserving some of that entitlement without sounding like we are. And so the problem with look-through companies is pretty hard to look all the way through to who's actually taking the loot. And it's not the taxpayer, sir, it's the person setting up complex tax structures such as LTCs, such as trusts, and many of those issues will be dealt with by Labour's capital gains tax, which, in the words of one senior tax expert, it's like playing netball on a court full of potholes. Capital gains tax fills in not all of them, but certainly the largest one. That's why it's been advocated by the Treasury, by the Reserve Bank, by the OECD, by the International Monetary Fund, and by, of course, all the major newspapers in New Zealand, most major media, and is polling extremely well. I think better than 2-1 relative to the government's proposal of selling down public equity in state-owned assets like power companies. Mr. Speaker, the public wants to keep, and they don't want, sir, to be sold down the river by tax law, which is full of loopholes. Expenditure on unsuccessful software development. Well, why, on a first principles basis, Mr. Speaker, why would the government allow people to write off a failed software project? Why is that distinctly different from any other business proposal? And that's one of the issues. So like the fifth rules, like the bank thin cap rules, which we support increasing, and other matters in this bill that we'll look forward to discussing with the government through the committee stages at the FEC and in the House. Thank you, sir.